While Street Fighter was a hit at the arcade, the fighting game genre spent a lot of time in a niche of the gaming world. The larger community of gamers mostly ignored the genre. That has changed really quickly in the last couple of years, and the fighting game community has exploded in size. In this video, we take a look at some of the reasons why. Fighting games used to be a really popular genre in the arcade days, and there's an important reason why. Many of gaming's most famous and long-lived fighting game franchises started out in arcades. Street Fighter was basically the first. Mortal Kombat got a lot of attention for how it contrasted against Street Fighter, and Tekken had the unique selling point of 3D fighting arenas. But the thing that all these games had in common was the element of head-to-head competition. Arcades became centers of gaming communities, and gamers had rivals in the community on different games. While most games used leaderboards or limited lives to tempt players into spending their quarters, fighting games were the avenue outside the saloon. You'd meet your opponent there at high noon and duel them to the death of the in-game character. The tournaments that took place in these communities are the first genuine examples of esports in the gaming world. Sure, there were no sponsors and there wasn't a massive Twitch stream, but it was the same thing in spirit. But when consoles started to beat the arcades, fighting games lost a bit of their appeal. The biggest thing that gamers lost as gaming shifted from arcades to homes was the community aspect. See, online multiplayer wasn't a thing yet, so the only way to play games with your friends was to invite them to your place. That's a lot harder to set up than meeting up at an agreed upon location outside. If you had siblings, you could play against them, but how many times can you beat your little bro, or be the one getting beat, before it gets old? Arcades didn't disappear overnight, and fighting games still reigned at the arcades. One thing that developers may have started to realize is that the games required a little more depth that players would want to explore on their own, giving the games an appeal besides the competitive aspect. From here on out, we're going to take a look at a few reasons why fighting games are so popular right now. For starters, fighting games have become very deep and intricate now. See, anyone can learn the rules of chess and start playing, but players who really want to get into chess are driven by one question: how do they win? The same is true in many ways of fighting games. When you buy into a series in this genre, it's a lot like picking up a game like chess or Go. There's some fun to be had at the surface level, but there's an intricately designed system that has evolved across dozens of releases for the older franchises. There are people in the pro scene that play these games in ways you couldn't imagine on day one. But what if you could become one of them? Developers know this is what their fans want, and they include a lot of things for you to do as a single player that ultimately let you hone your skills as a fighter. You can play against AI fighters at different levels, and while you're at it, you can experience the game's storyline too. There are also training modes that let you wallop on dummy enemies. And while games used to tease you to spend more time with them by locking away fighters, that isn't really a thing anymore. One thing that's changed a lot in the past years is how much of that system the game will now lay out for you in tutorials and in-game manuals. There was a time when players discovered the cancels in Street Fighter by accident, and it took a lot of work to get them right. Now you can learn all about cancels, juggles, counters, and so on right inside the game through an interactive tutorial that walks you through the steps. The reason why this is important is because people in general are more willing than ever to really invest and dedicate themselves to something. But if they try to play fighting games and encounter some arcane and unknowable system, they'll walk away. That's why games have an emphasis on laying out all their cards on the table from the get-go. Of course, that drive to master a particular fighting game comes across from the professional scene of the game. Earlier, we talked about how community tournaments were the first examples of esports. That scene continued to evolve into bigger and bigger tournaments, and before long, fighting games were the biggest genre in esports, alongside StarCraft. All this was a decade or so ago, when esports were a niche thing. Tournaments like EVO were hard to stream online, and not everyone could physically go to the tournaments. But games like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Rocket League, and the Battle Royale genre gave a shot of adrenaline to the popularity of esports. The biggest esports titles now command hundreds of millions of views on Twitch, and fighting games are no exception. If you love playing a game, whether it's a video game or tabletop game or sports, it's very natural to feel inspired by watching players who can just do it so much better. They can show you new facets and approaches to a game that you loved already, and before you know it, you're trying to replicate their moves at home. And once you've developed some mastery of the game, you can now test your skills online. Online multiplayer is a pretty mandatory part of fighting games these days. These games have worldwide communities, and and developers want to connect them across the globe so they can beat each other up and figure out who's the best. There's a saying in the military that the best laid plans fall apart in the first encounter with the enemy. You may have beaten the training dummy and the AI to a pulp, but on your first online outing, you may still end up being your opponent's mob. That failure leads you to train more and face more and more enemies online until you've become a capable fighter against humans. The interesting thing about this is that online multiplayer allows you to find people to play against a lot more easily than the arcades. They don't have to be from your local community, they don't have to work out a time with you. You barely need to know who your online opponent is. All you know is that you need to step over your opponent to reach the highest levels of the game. Street Fighter 4 was a massive success for Capcom, to the point where they struggled to get players to migrate to Street Fighter 5. Even as they hype up the 6th iteration of the series, people are still religiously playing the 4th. For many fans, Street Fighter 4 is the ultimate version of the series, and it does everything we've talked about so far right. But there's so much more to this genre than just Street Fighter. The last, but not the least reason why fighting games are so popular is because there are so many of them right now. In fact, the broader fighting game community might even consider Street Fighter to be entry level at this point, a game that takes things back to basics and really puts the contest of skills before anything else. But if that's not the kind of game you could fall in love with, there are so many others you can choose from. Let's say you're looking for a superhero themed game. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is still popular in this genre, and while its follow-up bombed a little, it still has a community of its own. Meanwhile, NetherRealm Studios has developed Injustice 2 into a game for serious fighting game players. If you're a Nintendo person, the Smash series has a prestige all its own in the community. Indeed, Smash players are uniquely respected because these games are very different from the usual fighting game and harder to master too. For anime fans, Guilty Gear and The King of Fighters are the old stalwarts that continue to impress to this day, but they have their contemporaries. BlazBlue and Skullgirls are two of the most popular anime-style fighting games, and they bring a fresh and unique take to this particular corner of the genre. And finally, if 2 dimensions are too few for you, you can check out the 3D fighters. Tekken still rules supreme in this genre, but the Soul Calibur series has a cult following of its own. The weapons and ability to knock opponents off the battlefield bring a unique flavor to these games compared to Tekken. No matter what you're looking for, there's a fighting game for you. With all these options and the challenge and enjoyment they offer, is it any wonder why fighting games are coming back into style right now? That's it for today's video. If you weren't a fighting game fan before, have we convinced you to give this genre a chance? And if you were a fan, what are your games of choice? Also, tell us candidly how good you are at them. Every player of fighting games is on their own personal journey to be the champ. Sound off in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.